In this video, I'm going to show you how you can tackle open shapes. And this would include something like a background in this particular drawing. It'll also include the chair and the sweater. So first let's contrast it with a shape that's a lot easier to draw, to fill in, which would be the sleeves. Right? All I have to do is use the quick selection tool and it selects that and I can add to it. And that's pretty simple and I've already done that. But when we get to the sweater vest, we see that I didn't actually close the shape, I just kind of left it ambiguous, which makes it more difficult to fill in. It's the same thing with the car and these areas. And I think that the way that we're going to do this is first by filling in a big shape, and then we're going to use the brush tool to soften the edges. So let's start by using the polygon lasso tool. The wand or the other quick selection tools won't really work here, and it's because it's open. So you'll see if I try using that, it just selects basically the whole document, which is not what we want. So I'm going to hit Command D or Control V to deselect, and we're just going to use the polygon lasso tool to select the general the shape, and we're going to end it off with a blunt line, and then we're going to fix it afterwards. So let's just select this and just end it over here. And I'm using the polygon lasso tool. The shortcut for that is the letter L. And we're just selecting all the parts that we want in the vest. Okay, so now I have my vest selected and I can choose a color for it. Let's try a dark brown. And I think that looks very Thanksgiving-y, so I'm actually just going to change it to something else. Okay, I think that looks pretty okay. I'm happy with that. Now I hit Command or Control D to deselect. And as I said before, we have this blunt line, which I don't think looks very good. So what I want to do is use the brush tool. I'm going to make this brush a little bit bigger. Let's go like 50 pixels or whatever that number is. You can make the pixel number bigger by using, or smaller by hitting the brackets. And now what I'm going to do is my opacity is at 100, and what we can do is make another layer just in case we want to get rid of this later. And I'm just going to paint. I also want to make sure that the hardness is somewhere in the middle. I don't want it to be at 100 because then we'll have the exact same problem that we just had of having a blunt line. So I'm going to have my hardness be somewhere in the lower range. And then I'm just going to paint over this line. And we don't have to go so far down, but just doing this will give us a much softer edge. Now something else we can do is if we take the opacity down, we can paint over that and fade it out. And we can make the opacity lower again and then continue to fade it out. The opacity is the translucency. You can also think of it as the saturation. It's how much of the color. It's like if you were using watercolor paints, so like how much color is on your brush versus how much water. And doing that can also not only fades it away, but it also adds a nice texture to it. We can do the same thing with the chair, and ultimately we can do the same thing with the background. So let's say now I'm going to select the chair. And I'm going to select this part of the chair as well. So the way that you can add to your selection is by hitting the plus sign when you make another selection using the polygon lasso tool. And then I'm going to make another layer. I want this layer to be underneath the shirt just because I don't think I was so careful when I selected it. And I'm going to make this a pretty dark color. Because the seats in my car are pretty dark. And then we have this filled in. We can see that I didn't fill it in very nicely. And that's probably because I wasn't zoomed in. And I can either reselect it and fill it again, or I can just use the paintbrush and use a smaller, I'm using the brackets to make it smaller, or you can go here to make it smaller, and we can take the opacity back up to 100, so that way we can fill in these spaces, and this will help. This is how you would fill in those spaces. It's kind of, we're just touching it up. And we want a nice soft edge over here, and we can fix this spot. Okay, and now we get up to the part that we're focusing on, which is the blunt edges. And I'm gonna make my brush bigger, and again, you can use the brackets, or you can change the size by hitting over here and changing it manually. And now we're just gonna paint on a nice smooth edge. It might be a little difficult if you're using your fingertip, so try not to get frustrated if it takes you a few tries. And now we can also try fading it out, just like I did with the shirt, by taking down the opacity. There we go. And now we're fading that color out. Makes it look a little bit like a watercolor painting on those ends. Okay, so that's how you would do that. And if you wanted to keep going with the background, it's similar. It would just, it takes a little bit extra time. You have to figure out what you want in this background of this car. So let's say this part right here. The more complicated the shape is, of course, the harder it is to select it. So I'm just selecting these shapes. This is what the background is made of. Well, I also want to make, like, these are things that I specifically don't want. I want to shield from being in the background. I don't think that's a very good selection. So let's, really what I'm going to do is try selecting things that I don't want in the background. And then I can invert the selection. Deselect. So let's say we don't want our guy in the background, and we don't want the wheel in the background. And right now I'm going for speed over accuracy. When you do this on your own, you should probably try to be more accurate than I'm being right now. And then we can do this. And it's okay if it's not perfect. I'm actually going to get rid of this little triangle by hitting Option, and then we can get rid of that by selecting around it. Okay. Except I realize that this is the window, so really it should be in. So I'm actually going to add it back in by holding down Shift. And that lets me add to the selection. Okay, so that's part of the selection. Now I'm going to hit Shift again to add another part of the selection, this window. Right now what I'm selecting is the stuff that I don't want in the background. And now to invert this selection, to make it so instead of having, right now this is what's selected, so we can only paint inside of that, and this is selected. But what I'm going to do is go to Select, Inverse, which is also Command-Shift-I, and then you can, now this is what's selected, the background. Okay, so now what I want to do is pick a background color, whatever color the car is going to be on the inside. I'm picking a grayish color on the blue scale. And now I'm going to hit B to get the paintbrush, and I want to be fully saturated. I want to have a biggish brush because we're doing filling in a pretty big space. And then I'm just gonna whack in this area. I'm not using the paint bucket because there's too much selected. I'm just using the paintbrush, and I'm whacking this in. And you know what? And I'm on the wrong layer. I'm gonna hit undo, and I'm going to make another layer. I want this layer to be underneath let's just hit undo because we don't want to have painted on top of the chair. That was a mistake. What I want to do is have another layer, and that layer should be underneath. I'm keeping my mistakes in the video because you guys are going to be making some mistakes, so I want you to see how you can tackle them when you make them. So I'm just filling in this space with a big paintbrush. This might be difficult if you're using your fingertip, so don't stress out if it gets a little tough. And if you put this layer behind the other layers, then you actually don't even really need to worry about selecting them because you're just painting underneath other things. So that's how you would paint the background. Really what we're just doing is using the paintbrush instead of the paint bucket, so that way we have this soft edge. And now I'm going to do the same thing I did before, which is take my opacity down and paint around. And in this way I'm smoothing out the ends. I'm smoothing out the end so that way it fades away more naturally. And it adds this like watercolor texture, which I like. There we go. And that is how you would add a background. You just want to make sure that your background layer is the bottom layer, and then you don't even need to worry about the selecting because then you can just do it underneath everything else. If you have any questions, please reach out.